Hi everyone, this is Arpad from the YouTube channel Starpath Academy, and today I want to answer a question that was posted on my YouTube channel. And the question goes, we hear reports of Germany about the government enticing population to spy on each other and report to authorities non-politically correct conversations, Stasi style. Now, I assume this type of activity also happened in Romania. After all, with Russia, the apartment blocks were specially designed so that all the neighbors could hear each other due to the thinness of the walls, thus creating the carpeting of the walls trend. What I want to know is how citizens who heavily reported on others were handled after the government fell. I guess it could serve as a cautionary tale about people thinking being weak and giving in to the top-down management of social interactions, thinking they could just ride the wave led for them. A very good question. So my memories are good about my past. Of course, even as a child, I always paid attention what was happening around me, but usually my understanding of the communist, post-communist situation comes twofold. One, my actual memories that I had, and then what I understood from what was going around me then as a young child, right? Communism or after communism, and then later on having talks with my parents and then reinterpret them, right? And then understand why their behaviors was different in the house, outside of the house, in certain rooms it was different, why we didn't have a phone, why we only had one phone at my aunt's place, and we actually went there to talk and so on and so forth. Some things were weird, why we had to do this or that way in one sense, but it was normal for me because I was very young. Now, before I answer the question, I do want to say yes, we lived in an apartment at some point prior to moving to the homestead, and even afterwards we moved back to the city. So for instance, when we talk about the thinness of the walls weren't actually thin in the sense of like when I lived in Los Angeles in an apartment house, the walls were actually very thin, made out of paper, jokingly of course. But here the walls were quite heavy concrete, right? Reinforced concrete with steel and so on and so forth. But it was a very bad sound barrier, so you could very well hear your neighbors. Now we were kind of lucky because we only had one neighbor, because we were in the corner of these Soviet style block apartments, so we had only one wall that was common with another neighbor who we tend to knew well, of course, and the other two sides were the outside of the building, which is bad because the heat would dissipate there, and the other side was an actual empty spot that was used for other reasons. So just saying that of course it was very weird for me that we had carpets on the wall, especially on that wall that was common with our neighbor. So you would never see something like this, like an empty wall this big in a Soviet apartment building, because you could hear your neighbors through, right? And very well put, that was sort of socially designed that you knew wherever you were, especially within the house, that somebody could be listening. And this was so entrenched in the kind of memory of people and internalized in people that the older generation, like grandfathers or my wife's grandfather, talked very in a slow, hushed down voice in his own house, even well beyond communism, because it was entrenched to them that he can never speak too loud because somebody could always overhear them, right? So it became internalized, and that is one thing that I want to point out before we move forward, that the worst part of this is that we internalize it, or people used to internalize it. That means, and if you don't take anything else from this video, then please listen to the following few sentences. The fact that you knew that anyone, especially government authorities could be listening into you at any time was much better tool than actually them listening. So I'll repeat, the fact that you knew that they could be listening at any point was a much more effective tool than them actually listening, because at that point it became internalized that you would not speak the thoughts you would think, which in end result eventually gets to the point that you start thinking less and less about things, right? Anyone listening to you or having threat against you is one thing. You know, some people just dealt with that. They didn't care and they suffered some consequences because of that. But those are free-minded people who could never control. And yes, the control grid was there for them to spot these people and kind of separate them and so on and so forth. But it wasn't that they were against these people. These people were just in the way. What they were against was you forming thoughts that you knew that they didn't like. So it was a social control to the level that they control your thought patterns, and they change after a while. Because, and let's put this in a modern context, if you know some topic is quote unquote controversial, which is sometimes stupid, like a January date or whatever, it doesn't matter, or even where you stand on. The fact that you know that the authorities have a certain type of view of something, may that be true or false, the fact that you know that and you are even afraid to Google or research that because you could be on some listening device or list or whatever, is much more of an effective tool than them actually having the systems together to listen on people or listen on your search results and so on. So and that is because you develop slowly a pattern where you don't even think about questioning authority. So and then of course this is reinforced, right, where if you, I don't know if you haven't or don't know about this yet, but of course whenever you search on a topic, especially mildly controversial, nothing too way out there, even then you can know that the search results kind of say, oh, 28 million results, or billion sometimes, or hundreds of million results. But as soon as you start paging after page 5, 10, usually the results are just repeating or the same regurgitated stuff from different websites, but always the same pattern, right? And then after page 25, there's no more results. So knowing this as a system, now you don't even want to Google it, you don't even want to research it, because you know that the kind of the topics have been locked, right? So you have to watch out for this. It's not that the topics have been locked. The fact that you know that the topics have been locked makes you don't want to even do the effort to think about some topic differently. And these may be topics that you agree, disagree, or we might be in disagreement with. It doesn't matter. I'm just talking about the patterns. Now getting back to the point where how some of the people who, let's just say, reported too often, or it came up to the community's conclusion that if ever you mentioned something, because the punishments were from very light to very severe based on what they thought you think or how you think. It could be, again, I mean, this would have been news like 10 years ago, but now, you know, somebody losing their job over something that they said used to be only, that's how it used to be in communism. Well, right. So that's no longer news for you. But the punishment was from very light to, you could get into trouble and you would be called into the secret police offices, to beatings, to you losing everything, your livelihood, or even jail, or sometimes you go to the camp, right? Which was kind of stupid because people get sent to there for reasons that you as a very liberal minded people think that communism wouldn't have done that. But let's just say applied communism was very different than the communism you have in your mind. Anyway, so the people who the community knew that they were kind of HubSpots of you getting into trouble, right? There was a way how people dealt with that afterwards. But even before we get to the fall of communism and the kind of the end of that type of government in Romania, even then there were some techniques, I guess I could say, how people dealt with disagreeing with things, in the sense of whenever there was a topic that was regurgitated again and again and again in a very monotone way, people who would actually disagree with that would say that word for word, right? And you would regurgitate that. In the sense, if you would have a talk with an officer of secret police who would be here to get to know how you think, or are you part of some counter-revolutionary or whatever, and this is what I've been told, of course. So you would regurgitate the exact same talking point that way. Never deviate, right? They would say something, you would repeat that. They would say something, you would repeat that. You would say something, they would repeat that. To the type of monotone thing that you would have a plausible deniability that you agree with it, but like if you had any two brain cells to drop together, you would know that this guy is just repeating the same things, never adding anything, never subtracting, never even having an opinion about the topic, because that would be like his wall blocking your logic, which became actually quite I wouldn't say offensive, but like it would show the stupidity of an officer or a neighbor who would talk too much to the officers, that he knows that you are someone that he cannot trust, right? And it would become to the point where it would become almost comical, and people have used that, right, and to the point where these things became jokes, that you so much so agree to with the talking point that it becomes stupid, which in itself it is, but you kind of overdo that, right, and constantly overdo that, and in a sarcastic way, right, to the point where it becomes comical. And that's how some of the Soviet jokes have started, right? And I can give you an example of this, right? Actually, this was told by Ronald Reagan, if I'm correct. And the joke goes where the Soviet citizen talks with an American citizen, and the American citizen says, "Oh, we have such a freedom that, such a level of freedom that if I don't like anything, I can go to the White House and pound on Ronald Reagan's desk and say, Mr. President, I do not like how you run this country," right? And the Soviet guy says, "Oh, I can do that as well, no problem." "Oh, you can?" "Of course I can. I can go to Moscow and go into the Kremlin and pound on Gorbachev's desk and say, Mr. Gorbachev, I do not like how Ronald Reagan run his country." So that was kind of a joke where you're so free that you can always tell the loud opinion, so those became comical to the point where it became hard for at least the officers who had some level of soul still in them to do their job, because they knew that it was idiotic that they would do. And the good quality men left, and it made it harder for the government to keep on doing what they were doing, oppressing people during those times, right? Everything's funky now. But so it would hard, but that also meant that the more idiotic people would follow every stupid rule to the T. So it was actually, at some point, it became harder, and then it became so hard that it was impossible to keep up with everything. So I wanted to tell that. So that was kind of a strategy of you repeating the talking point so often back to the person, to the neighbor, that it became idiotic, and that way still having plausible deniability, which was very important to have those times. You would let them still know that you're an idiot, that you are even doing this. Now, where it comes to the actual answer of the second part of the question, but I wanted to give a bigger context. Well, I won't be able to tell you much because reasons, of course. But let me tell you some things, right? So the people who were kind of information spots were not always the people that you thought they would be. And let me give you some examples. Sometimes they were pastors. Sometimes they did it willingly, listening into the congregation. It was sometimes it was a very high trust person in the society, but he was in on it either for money, or many times they were actually physically tortured to perform these tasks. And some didn't want to do, and they were carried away. Some pastors were there, some actually committed suicide afterwards, and some have written books how they were treated by the secret police. So it's a very complex story. You cannot just say like, oh, there are two types of people, right? But you have to watch out when we're talking about this, because it's a very complex topic, and sometimes the people who you would have trust the most were the actual people who the secret police has used against you, and sometimes it wasn't their choice. So for that reason alone, you have to think about how you share DMs, who you talk with, and do you still have that plausible deniability thing. That was the case back then. Of course, now everything is hunky-dory. So thank God for all the good stuff we have today and today's leadership, right? So yes, so things were dealt differently in small towns and in big cities. Small towns would be able to sniff out, what's happening and who's doing what. And even during the time, if that was the case, you would be very isolated very soon. And you would have a harder life right there in the small town, and you would have to leave afterwards. But that was definitely the case after the fall of government and after the fall of the Soviet Union, that it was almost always the case that they would have to leave, maybe change name, and go into a big city and kind of blend in with a different crowd. If not, there were some things that would happen usually. So in bigger cities, it was different because it was harder to sniff out. It was almost like almost everyone was sort of an informant to some level. So it was more like levels of informants, I guess. And usually it was their life would be harder only after the fall of communism, and even that to just a certain degree. They would not necessarily have to change names, move away. They would be able to blend in with the old Soviet crowd in some way and still maybe have a different type of job, go somewhere else, and so on and so forth. But politically, it was always pushed after the fall of communism. Let's get over with this, and let's put all the past behind us, and let's not drag our past into the current bright future that we're looking into. Because you have to remember that it was actually, we're stepping out of communism to a more liberal, in the classical sense, liberal society where everything's okay and everything is, you have the liberty to say anything, basically. So that kind of softness of that liberal mentality, let's put everything behind us, was definitely another element that was pushing against this, but they didn't have success. And the general idea of people, well, we're just glad it's over, that type of stuff. That wasn't the case in small towns. I'm not going to tell concrete examples. I don't know of any, right? But there were rumors that were people sent out from the small towns to find some of these people. Like usually it would be like a group of people who suffered would get at least two of them to go after people who have caused the suffering afterwards. And sometimes this was served very cold, in the sense 10 years, 15 years after. And of course. So anyway, I'm not going to go into details, but social dynamics is very complex, and just because you don't see these retaliations, or even it was politically pushed that there's no need for this, things did happen in the background, I'm sure of it. right? But there were levels. So in the sense, if you were a very low level neighbor, an informant, your punishment might be much more severe by the community or society or people who got sent after you, because you were just, after the fall, you were kind of just that guy who served the bad people back then. But if you were a high level politician or high level government official in the Soviet Union, you usually get away with it. You know, it was very, like, most of the percentage, unless you pissed someone really off, which was the case in some times, and you would hear that, you know, they would disappear or something. But what I want to say is that the higher levels of politicians or in the Politburo, what has happened, they have morphed into capitalists. And I want you to understand this, because when many people talk about communism, capitalism, and so on and so forth, you're talking from a little man's perspective. And I mean this in the most honest and sincere and good way. Like, you actually may believe in the theoretical, applications of what you believe in. Oh, this is how it's supposed to do. But at the very high level, what we have found out, of course, that the biggest communists, the biggest peddlers of communism, immediately became capitalists, the biggest capitalists, when the new system served them. And I want you to remember this, because this layer, this echelon of people, it doesn't matter what the system is. It doesn't matter what name the system has. They will, quote unquote, do well as long as they fit in. And they make sure that them and their friends fit in. So what happened, they just formed a new party, right? Sometimes the more honest one, I guess, in Russia and some other places, they just left, oh, we're gonna stay in the Communist party, and that's how they continue. And I guess you could say that to some degree you would admire them, that at least they stuck to their guns, you know. But the most vile ones, I would say they would immediately change party, and maybe, I just say, blue party or something like that, and not necessarily them having a high position in the party, but it would be their descendants, you know. And it's very, very common in Hungary, Romania. These I know for sure, but I'm pretty sure many other Eastern European countries, that these new chic hip parties are actually all from descendants of former communists who became huge big time capitalists or whatever. It's just a way how to continue power for them. And for those people, as much as you would like to have, or I'm assuming you would like to believe that there were some repercussions, most of the times there were not, with the exception of a select few, which really, well, I just say things happen. Anyway, I hope this kind of explained it for you, and that was the history, and that is history how I know it. Well, looking forward to this new great endeavor that we're going into in the future. All right, talk to you later.